Okay, in the next two videos, we're going to be looking at the impact that globalisation has had on Australia, and including a whole range of different measures of Australia's performance. So in this first video, we're going to look at the impact globalisation has had on inflation or prices in Australia, the impact globalisation has had on consumer choice, and the impact globalisation has had on Australian labour markets. So first things first, the impact of globalisation on inflation. Basically, globalisation allows consumers to purchase better quality products at lower prices. So it allows us to source products from overseas without having to pay tariffs. That reduces the price of imports and therefore keeps the average price of goods and services relatively low. So, for example, in the last 20 years, as globalisation has become more and more prevalent, prices have increased by around 3%. That compares to growth of around 9% in the 80s and 90s. So the inflation rates have been a third of the increase in inflation has been growing at a third of the pace since we started to adapt towards more and more globalisation. Basically, what the reasons for that is that not only do the tariffs make imports cheaper directly, so we get access to cheaper imports from overseas, the tariff cuts also boost competition and force Australian firms to reduce their costs of production. So there's a range of reasons why globalisation reduces inflation, and that comes down to one, from a really simplistic level, we don't have to pay a tax on imports, the imports become cheaper. Two, if we're using imports in the production process, which many firms do, they don't have to pay as much for their intermediate products, which makes things cheaper. And three, Australian firms have to become more efficient as well, and therefore we're more likely to lower our prices. So the impact of globalisation has seen many firms adopting things like performance-based pay, and that's encouraged more efficiency and lower prices. The other reason why globalisation reduces inflation is because it encourages business specialisation. So businesses specialise in what they're good at, and because we're doing what we're good at, we're more efficient, and that keeps prices down as well. We also benefit from economies of scale because of our larger markets, and that also makes prices lower. So as a bit of a summary, the impact of globalisation on prices is a range of links you can make from globalisation to inflation. One, consumers directly get access to cheaper imported consumer goods. Things that we're buying from overseas are cheaper directly because we don't have to pay a tariff on them. Secondly, for businesses get access to cheaper capital. So, for example, what we're talking about capital is the machinery that we're using in the production process, but they also get access to cheaper intermediate imports that they're using in production. So for the difference there is, for example, if we're baking cakes, actually that's not a good example, if we're making cars, we might get access to cheaper machinery to help make the car, but we can also get access to cheaper engines and cheaper parts, which also helps to reduce production costs. For businesses, it also encourages specialisation, which again helps us become more productive because we specialise in what we're good at or where we have comparative advantage. That leads to lower prices as well. And the benefits from economies of scale from producing in a large volume or producing products on a larger volume also helps to keep prices down. Thirdly, Australian import competing businesses. So Australian firms that are competing against foreign firms are forced to become more efficient to compete with those cheaper imports, and that leads to lower prices as well. So as a summary, consumer goods that we're buying from overseas are cheaper because there's no tariffs. Businesses get access to cheaper capital and access to cheaper intermediate imports. Increased specialisation lowers prices, benefits of economies of scale lowers prices, and Australian firms have to become more efficient due to the extra competition. All of these factors help to contain inflationary pressures, lead to cheaper prices for things like white goods and clothing and electronics and computers, televisions, vehicles, etc. Secondly, globalisation boosts consumer choice. Households have access to a larger variety of products from all around the world. So we get access to telecommunications, equipment, computers, clothing, furnishings, computers, etc., etc. There's a greater diversity of products that we can get access to at a cheaper price. The access to e-commerce or online shopping allows us to buy things cheaper from overseas. So Australians spend around $20 billion online, and about 20% of that is on international purchases. The fact that we have access to the internet allows us to reduce search times and buy things quicker and more conveniently, and gives us access to better quality products at lower prices. So unfortunately, many locally brands have been replaced by multinationals, but overall consumer choice has increased, and there has been lower prices as a result of freer trade and globalisation. In terms of the impact on the labour market, okay, globalisation has had a big impact on the labour market. In terms of the strengths of the labour market, it has encouraged deregulation. So what that means is that we need to stay competitive because prices are cheaper overseas. That's encouraged firms to undertake things like enterprise bargaining agreements, where most firms now pay people based on productivity to try and become more internationally competitive so we can compete on a global scale. This has involved removing of sort of a lot of government protection, removing of union membership, trying to scale back unfair dismissal laws, but it's also led to more part-time and casual work to try and make things more flexible for businesses to also reduce their cost of production. The idea of all this stuff, so the enterprise bargaining agreements, tying wages to productivity, getting rid of unfair dismissal laws, relaxing the minimum wage requirements, all of this is designed to keep our products cheaper and therefore allow us to export more to overseas so that we can boost overall production and GDP. In terms of weaknesses, the main weaknesses has been that there's been increased structural unemployment. So firms that aren't able to compete have often lost their jobs, so like the car industry that we've looked at. It's also led to more outsourcing, so firms, and we'll talk about this in the next slide, firms are more likely to outsource a lot of their labour to overseas firms. It's led to many companies moving overseas, so Arnott's, Heinz, Mitsubishi, Pacific Brands, which sells all like your Bonds underwear, Telstra and Qantas have all suffered due to increased competition. Workers in competitive, efficient firms with high sales and profits have reaped the rewards, while others in manufacturing and other areas where we don't have comparative advantage have suffered and experienced decreased incomes and decreased living standards. So it's led to a greater inequality because those that have benefited have become richer, particularly owners of multinational companies and those that work in areas of comparative advantage, while other industries have really suffered on the back of this because they can't compete, and that's led to more structural unemployment. So it has led to a bigger gap between the rich and the poor. In terms of what's meant by outsourcing and offshoring, outsourcing of jobs in the service sectors basically involves relocating jobs to different particular areas. So outsourcing, generally, a company uses an external organisation to provide some of their services, as opposed to moving the whole company overseas. So outsourcing isn't moving the whole company overseas, it's just getting certain services to be done overseas, where offshoring refers to a process whereby jobs are relocated overseas, and it generally occurs when the whole company moves overseas to reduce labour costs. So for example, banks and telecommunication companies moving IT functions offshore would be an example of outsourcing. Many low-skilled jobs, including call centres, are prone to outsourcing because it's now cheaper. And that's why it's important for Australia to focus on high-skilled professions, because a lot of low-skilled professions are being outsourced overseas. Outsourcing is one of the key reasons why that globalisation has led to a more inequitable distribution of income. Okay, because those areas that are low-skilled can be more and more regularly being shifted overseas. That's led to a lot of job losses for unskilled workers. In terms of, lastly, the impact on the manufacturing sector, the big impact on the manufacturing sector has been through China. So as China has industrialised their economy and focused more and more on manufacturing, basically Australia hasn't been able to compete. So the lower labour costs have meant that a lot of Australian workers have lost their jobs. Australia's often struggled to export manufactured products because we have high wages here, and we're also a long way away from other countries. So that limits our ability to trade because it costs more to transport. We also struggle because we're a smaller market to take advantage of economies of scale. So Australia's manufacturing sector really only survived in the 80s and 90s due to high tariffs and subsidies. Manufacturing share of GDP continues to fall, and there's been more and more closures on the back of trade liberalisation and globalisation. Thank you.